His portraits, however, are free from this sort of rhodomontade, intensely direct and real. In them he is neither rhetorical nor cold, but full of fire and the freshness of youth. Before any face to be modelled, he forgot the Greeks and Romans, saw life alone, was rejuvenated in the youth-giving fount of nature, and painted, almost alone of the painters of his generation, the truth. David was one of the first of the men of the Revolution to come beneath the spell of the little corporal. One day, while he was working at his studio at the Louvre, a pupil rushed in breathlessly. "General Bonaparte is outside the door." Napoleon entered in a dark blue coat that made his lean yellow face look leaner and yellower than ever. David dismissed his pupils and drew in a sitting of barely 2 hours the stern head of the Corsican. Thus he passed into the service of Napoleon. He was appointed imperial court painter and executed that colossal picture which has handed down to posterity a true presentation of the ceremonial pageant that took place in Notre Dame on December 2nd, 1804. The moment selected is that in which Napoleon, already crowned, is placing the crown upon the head of the Empress. The coronation was the great work of his imperial period, as the Marat had been of his revolutionary period. He had been so intimately identified with both that after Napoleon's final fall in 1815 and the succession of Louis XVIII, he was banished and sought refuge in Brussels, where he died in 1825. He left behind a legacy of so-called classicalism, carrying on that of Poussin, which under various modifications has been preserved by the official academy as the basis of instruction in and the proper aim of painting. These academic principles, however, no longer confine the student to an imitation of Roman subjects and models. But even as David permitted himself to be a naturalist in his portraits and in other subjects, such as the death of Marat and the coronation, so the Academy encourages still the study of nature, but within certain limitations. It lays a special stress upon what it calls the ideal line, an ideal beauty of form and composition. Nature must be corrected to conform with the ideal representations handed down to us from Greek and Roman sculpture and the paintings upon Greek vases. As Delacroix, mocking at these principles, said, "In order to present an ideal head of a Negro, our teachers make him resemble as far as possible the profile of Antinous, and then say, 'We have done our utmost. If, nevertheless, we fail to make the Negro beautiful, then we ought not to introduce into our pictures such a freak of nature, the squat nose and thick lips which is so unendurable to the eyes.'" This extreme view, which would exclude any subject that is not capable of being idealized, is no longer maintained by the Academy, yet it still insists upon the prime importance of the line. And, as a result, the figures in academic pictures are usually in graceful poses and enclosed by sharp outlines. A comparison of the Horatii with Delacroix's Dante and Virgil will show the distinction very clearly. But, as a matter of fact, in nature the forms of objects are not sharply outlined. Even when a dark tree cuts against a light sky, the atmosphere that intervenes between it and our eyes tends to blur its edges. Now, these effects of light and atmosphere depend not so much upon the way the picture is drawn as upon the way it is painted, and this again is connected with problems of color. Accordingly, the academician, precise about form, disregards problems of light and atmosphere and color, while the colorist, who cares most for these qualities and sees nature as an arrangement of colored forms in harmonious relation, very often disregards the beauty of form, and, because of what he aims at, cannot make the lines of his object so precise and ideally perfect. On the other hand, it is the little irregularities and indistinctness of line that give character to forms and suggest that they have the capacity of movement and are alive. The academic figure, notwithstanding its beauty, is by comparison inert and rigid. You may realize this point by a reference to these two pictures we are studying. The figures of the men in the Horatii have come to gestures and positions of energy, and hold them as if cast in bronze. The women have been placed in pretty attitudes of amiable sentiment, and remain as if modelled in wax. But in the Dante and Virgil, there are life and movement, terrific action put forth and sustained in the figures of Charon and of the two men who grip the gunwale, action of another kind in the Dante as he gazes with horror and balances himself in the rolling boat. Even the latter moves, and the shades, although exhausted to impotence, are moving. This picture of Delacroix has been called in a pictorial sense the first characteristic picture of the century. That is to say, while the art of David and his followers was virtually a translation of sculpture into painting, Delacroix once more asserted the independence of painting, and its possession of certain qualities and possibilities which no other art possesses in the same degree. For in the place of the tinted forms of the academicians, Delacroix had introduced the wonder of colour used for purposes of expression by such masters as the Venetians and Rubens. Delacroix, in fact, was one of the greatest colourists of the 19th century, using the word in the sense of one who thinks and feels and expresses himself by means of colour. He nurtured himself upon the works of the colourists in the Louvre, especially upon Rubens. Every morning before his work began, it is said he drew an arm, a hand, or a piece of drapery after Rubens. It is from Rubens also and Titian that Watteau, the great poet-painter of the 18th century, had drawn inspiration. And Delacroix, like him, was proud, self-reliant, delicate from his youth up, and for many years sick in soul and body. But whereas Watteau drew from the licentiousness of the regent's court the food for his dreams of poetry, Delacroix into his closed studio admitted the mighty impulses which had been let loose by the Revolution. Liberty had given larger bounds to individualism, and the first of the arts to reflect this was literature. The measured prose, conventionally correct verse, and somewhat pedantic rhetoric of the 18th century had been succeeded by an outburst of the imaginative faculty. The movement began in Germany with Goethe, in England with Wordsworth and Scott, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley and Keats, and in France with Victor Hugo. During a visit to London in 1825, Delacroix saw the opera of Goethe's, Faust, performed in English, while he had already discovered Shakespeare, Byron and Scott to be his favourites. His own romantic nature flamed up by contact with theirs. He was possessed with their souls, and became the first of the romantic painters. He took many of his subjects from the poets of his preference, not to translate into literal illustrations, but to make them express in his own language of painting the most agitated emotions of the human heart. But the representation of agitated emotions necessitated the introduction of a good deal that was horrible to those who swore by the ideal line and perfect balance of composition. "How can ugliness," they cried, "be beautiful?" Victor Hugo produced his play of Hernani in 1829, and around him and Delacroix waged the battle between the classicists and the romanticists. Poussin's phrase was repeated by the classicists: "Painting is nothing more than drawing." Had God intended to place colour at the same height as form, wrote Charles Blanc, he would not have failed to clothe his masterpiece man with all the hues of the hummingbird. And this critic called Delacroix the tattooed savage who paints with a drunken broom. To these and similar denunciations, continued for many years, Delacroix himself in one of his writings has contributed a reply. It pleads for a wider conception of the idea of beauty. Winckelmann, the great German archaeologist of the 18th century, had asserted, "The sole means for art to become, if possible, inimitably great, is the imitation of the ancients. The marble manner only requires a little animating. The highest beauty is that which is proper neither to this nor to that person, that is to say, not individual." This was practically the doctrine of the classicists. To it Lessing, another German, replied that truth to nature was the first condition of beauty, and Goethe expanded it by saying that everything natural was true as far as it was beautiful. The English Keats chimed in, "Truth is beauty, beauty is truth." Delacroix's words are, "This famous thing, the beautiful, must be, everyone says so, the final aim of art. But if it be the only aim, what are we to make of men like Rubens, Rembrandt, and in general all the artistic natures of the North, who preferred other qualities belonging to their art? There is no recipe by which one can attain to what is ideally beautiful. Style depends absolutely and solely upon the free and original expression of each master's peculiar qualities. Upon individuality, in fact. There are, among others, some important considerations in these views of the Romanticists, which may be put in the following familiar way. It is quite possible for an exceedingly pretty girl to be very stupid. There is also such a thing as the beauty of character. We enjoy the beauty of the slimness of the silver birch and the rugged staunchness of an oak. There is a charm about a Gloucester fisherman, as well as an Apollo Belvedere. On the whole, we do well to be interested in people for what they are rather than what they might be. Individual character is always worth studying. When it is exhibited under the stress of powerful emotion, it is conspicuously so. The artist himself may be a man of marked individuality of character. It is better for the world that he should express himself freely, instead of within the tight groove of some conventional method. The classicists were entrenched in the official fortress of the Academy, and for long years resisted the attempts of Delacroix to obtain entrance. Indeed, it was not until 22 years after his death, when a great collection of his works were exhibited, that France realized how grand an artist it had lost. Before he died, other men with other motives, as we shall see, rose up to challenge the official standard of excellence. For the history of painting in the 19th century, centering in Paris, has been one of continually new assertions of individualism. Our sympathies quite possibly will be with the rebels. But that should not blind us to the value of the academic principles of painting. If there is to be an official and permanent standard, the classic is the best for the purpose. The standard, to be serviceable, must be one that can be reduced to a reasonable certainty. In painting, composition and line are the elements, which can most readily be formulated, and, when founded upon the canons of antique art, are established upon a basis that the continuing judgment of the world has approved. Given this central body, there is the perpetual inducement for independent spirits to fly off at a tangent from it, which is productive of vitality. The classical ideal provides at once firm groundwork for the average student and a starting point for independent genius. Permanence and progress are alike ensured.